Very famous story of Jesus riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, the seat of power for the Jewish nation, right up to the temple, the place of power for the Jewish nation, and then driving out all the money changers and the people who were selling goods and stuff there. I wonder if Jesus were to come today and ride into Washington, D.C., down Pennsylvania Avenue and head to our Capitol building, what would be the reception? Right? I think about that. Like, if he were to go as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, go to the White House or to the Capitol building and go up there, I think some people would be saying, finally, yay, finally the king is coming and he's going to set those other guys straight, right? And he's going to set those people straight. He's going to take over and do what needs to be done. I think some people would look at that and think Jesus might walk into the Capitol building, grab some Democrat and some Republican, go, knock their heads together. I think that would happen probably, right? Would politicians surrender their opinions to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? If Jesus were to walk in and say, let me tell you what to do that is right, that is noble, that in the eyes of God is the correct thing to do regarding whatever issues, whether it be war in Israel or in the Ukraine or dealing with poverty or immigration, and the king would speak and finally lay down the true law from the Lord God Almighty, what would be the result? Would everybody go, yay, finally, the person who knows the most gets to finally be in charge? Or do you think they would fight? I think they would fight. What if he came into Spokane? What if Jesus rode a donkey to City Hall here, right? And came into City Hall, what would be the reception? Or yet, what if he rode a donkey to your house? What would be the reception? I think that most of us, although we look back in history as Christians and we would say, oh, those poor deluded people didn't realize the king had come and they missed him and they ignored him and a week later they killed him. And we think those poor deluded people, but the truth of the matter is, I think if Jesus were to do the same thing in the modern era, we would turn on him and kill him too. Because the thing is, you have to submit to Jesus. And when we all think we know exactly what Jesus would say and do, and then he comes and does something different, it kind of would blow us away. But he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's the one who gets to say what is right, what is wrong, what is truth, what is error. And a lot of us would be very surprised that he might not take our current side. That would be kind of alarming, wouldn't it? And it's a cause for us to all step back and think, I don't need to worry. I shouldn't be thinking about who's on my side. I should be thinking, am I on God's side? Am I on God's side? Because that's the only voice that wins in the end. Let's take a look at this story and unpack it a little bit, because there's some crazy, cool, wild stuff going on in this story of Jesus riding the donkey. It's found in Matthew chapter 21. Actually, all four Gospels have it, but I'm going to try to focus on the Matthew 21. We've got these Bibles. There's some on the tables. They're on the end caps of the aisles. If you need a Bible, grab one. And if you can, or get on your phone and get on Bible Gateway or something and pull Matthew 21 up. I'm using a New King James version. And let's read this bit of a story and see what we can learn from it. It says, now when they drew near Jerusalem and came to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them. And immediately he will send them. All this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So the disciples went and did as Jesus commanded them. They brought the donkey and the colt and laid their clothes on them and set him on them. And a very great multitude spread their clothes on the road. Others cut down branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And then the multitude who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna to the King of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he had come into Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, who is this? So the multitude said, well, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. And then Jesus went into the temple of God. Now let's just pause right there and catch the story up before we read any further. Okay, so here's the Passover celebration. And there were studies done of how many lambs, they could actually look this up in an ancient document, how many lambs were slaughtered at Passover about the time of Jesus. And the archaeological evidence exists that about 250,000 lambs were slaughtered. And one lamb, according to law, was supposed to feed 10 people. So upwards of 2 million people showed up at that time in Jerusalem for this high holy festival, which would have made it one of the most populated cities in the world at that time. They came from all over the Roman Empire. They came from all over North Africa, wherever Jews and sometimes just God-fearers had been. They all came to Jerusalem for the Passover. Many of them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime trip. And so when they made it to Jerusalem, you had people from literally all over the Roman Empire speaking all kinds of languages, but all attempting to worship the one true God as revealed through the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what they're doing there. Millions of people, a packed town crowded with folks from all over the world. And so here's Jesus, and he gets together with his team of apostles, and he's preparing to enter in Jerusalem. This is the last week of his life. And he starts in this place called Bethphage. If you were reading it in English, it'd be Bethphage. That's how we would pronounce it. But Bethphage is the way you would say it. And actually, the little town he's in, the name means house of unripe figs. That's going to play out in a little bit. And so there's a map. He stays in Bethany, which is on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And he's got friends down there, Martha and Lazarus and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And they're all hanging out there. He's raised Lazarus from the dead already. And so he marches from Bethany, and they're hanging out in Bethphage, this little tiny, almost nothing town on the outskirts of the backside of the Mount of Olives. And there he tells them, hey, go into town, and you're going to get this colt, right? Now, clearly, Jesus has prearranged this. He had followers from everywhere. He's got this prearranged colt to ride. And he says the password is, if anyone asks, just say, the master has need of it. The Lord has need of it. It's like, that's the password. So they'll know the colt's not being stolen. He gets on this donkey, and he rides it down the Mount of Olives and up into the city of Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about this, and Matthew quotes it, Matthew quotes the saying, it came by the prophet saying, tell the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. That actual phrasing comes from the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. He's quoting Zechariah. Zechariah lived about 550 years before Jesus. Zechariah lived at a time when all the Jews who had been deported from Jerusalem, sent into Babylon, had lived for 70 years. And then Cyrus the king comes on and he says, all of you people who've been deported from your homeland, if you want to go back, he'll let you go back. So a bunch of them go back to Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and they're going to rebuild it. And even though they're back in Jerusalem, the one thing they do not have is a king. See, when they went back, they were still under the authority of King Cyrus. The Babylonians still owned the empire. So they had a governor who was responsible to the king. They weren't their own nation. They could go back and worship their own God, but they could not become their own nation. And in that time, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls of the city. Lots of trouble goes down. That's Ezra, Nehemiah. Esther occurs about this time in history. And, of course, the prophet Zechariah would be one of the prophets of that time. And Zechariah is there prophesying about what would happen. He quotes this crazy verse. The Spirit of God comes upon him, and he tells them, the daughter of Zion, your king will come to you. One day you will get a king again. The rightful and true king will come. And here's how you recognize him. He'll ride into town on a donkey, right? On a colt. That's not how kings rode. When kings rode into town, they rode on a horse. They came in on a horse because a horse was something that meant power. It meant conquest. It meant military might. To ride in on a donkey conveyed none of those things. It conveyed peace. It conveyed everything was calm. Everything was all right. There isn't going to be a war going on here. There's no conquest when you ride a donkey. And so for 500 years, this prophecy had existed. And here's Jesus fulfilling it the last week of his life. It's interesting because in Mark, who tells the same story, he mentions that the colt had never been ridden. So it's a brand new colt, which I think is kind of interesting. It's like, I don't think Jesus had to tame it, right? Right? Think about breaking in this donkey. You're going to jump on it. What's going to happen? When you're Jesus, everything will be calm, right? You or me might have had some problems. So he jumps on this thing, and it's interesting because when Mark says it was never been written, it is kind of an interesting thing because in the Jewish law, any animal that had ever been used for a domestic use, like you hooked a plow to it and you plowed with it, or you hooked a donkey up to a mill and it went around in a circle grinding grain, once you've done that, that animal can never again be used for a sacred purpose. You can't take that animal and then use it for any religious service. So the fact that this donkey had never been ridden, had never been used, meant it had been reserved for some sacred purpose, not a domestic one. And it was a chosen donkey for this thing. The sacred purpose, of course, is to bring the Messiah into Jerusalem, to bring the King and the Lord into the city, the King that they had long awaited for, the King that had not sat on the throne since 586 BC. There had been no line from the King David sitting on the throne for that long, since the Babylonians had destroyed it. And here comes someone from the line of David, as we know reading Matthew and Luke, they have the genealogies. Someone from the line of David, rightful king, is riding into town on this donkey, right? And the people are crying out for peace. They're crying out this sense of, yay, finally things will be restored to what is right. Finally, someone will be in charge who knows exactly what to do. Finally, someone will come who's in charge. The king will come, because they've been under Roman occupation for a long time now. And so they've been well over 100 years, and they're sick of it. They're tired of it. They're tired of the taxes. They're tired of the oppression. They're tired of everything that's getting. They're crying out for peace. What they meant, though, was peace for us, war to them, right? They meant life for us, death to them. Freedom to us, slavery to them. Meaning the Jewish people at that time thought, this is what's going to happen. We're going to be elevated to being the top people in the world, and everybody else gets death and mayhem and chaos. We're going to release ourselves from the oppressors, and we'll be free, and this new king will judge and condemn all of them. You see, they saw the whole situation very narrowly. They saw it through their moment in history. Their own Jesus is thinking about all people in all times of history. They wanted a military leader, someone who would come in and be like a legal deliverer, free us from these laws, free us from this bondage. They meant peace from Rome. Jesus was coming, bringing peace from God. Whole different thing. Jesus was seeing the whole situation globally, and they were only seeing it very narrowly through their own nation. Americans don't do that. We don't do that, do we? No. We never look at issues just for America. We're always thinking globally, like God does. It's interesting that when Jesus comes in on this colt, it's kind of crazy. The creator of the world coming in humbly on a colt, right? I mean, sure, he could have ridden a horse. He could have driven a chariot. He could have come in any way he wanted. He could have come in as a mighty conquering hero. He could have come in that way. But the creator of the world, the master of the universe, the king of all kings of all time, chooses to come in super humble, riding a little foal, a donkey. And actually, the way the words are used in Greek, it's not probably about a 1-year-old, right? Very small, very timid, not a dominant creature at all. And it's interesting when you look at that, it's like he's showing that if he's the king, and they're crying out for him, Son of David is a title for the king. He's not going to lead a fanatical rebellion. He's not going to lead an armed revolution. He's not going to lead a nationalistic uprising. That's what the colt means, right? And although they're crying for that, it's sort of like the evidence is right in front of him. This king has different ideas. He has very different ideas. And then these phrases they are shouting out. Everybody's shouting out, Hosanna, right? Hosanna, which means save us now. That's what, if they'd have just translated it instead of just, bringing the Hebrew word over, it would have been, save us now, save us now. That's what it means. We want salvation. Of course, they meant salvation from the Roman government. Jesus means, salvation for your souls. Opening the gateway to heaven. That's what's happening. And when they're crying out, Son of David, that is a title that belonged only to the heir of the Davidic throne. The heir to the Davidic throne, which had been promised one day, someone from the line of David will come, and he will sit on this throne, and he will make all things right again. He will rule with absolute power and justice. He will rule the world, not just the nation of Israel. He will rule the world with power and righteousness and justice, and an iron rod and a scepter will be in his hand, and all of the world will come and bow down to him. That's the king they're looking for. That king is Jesus, but Jesus is doing it a different way. He's not going to do it on their terms. And then they're saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's an old Old Testament Hebrew scholar kind of way of looking at things in old Hebrew scriptures, when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that is a messianic title. That's a title looking for the Messiah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is a phrase meaning the Messiah is coming. That's the Messiah. What are you looking for in the world? We're looking for finally the true king to come, set up the throne, rule the world with peace, justice, righteousness. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. When that finally happens, the world will be set right. That's everybody's thinking. So here's the crowd, the 2 million people strong crowd, laying their coats before him, putting their palm branches down, crying out, save us now. You're the son of David. We know you're the rightful king. That's who you've got to be. Blessed is you who comes in the name of the Lord. You're the Messiah. Hosanna in the highest, meaning save us down. We're talking about the top levels, even God at work. And their coats and their palm branches, they're laying down their coats in front of him as he's walking on. That was a symbol that you would do to show that whoever walks on my coat has power over me. It's a way, when you laid down the coat, it said, walk over this coat that belongs to me. It's me giving you the authority to be my king, my leader. They had done it once in 2 Kings chapter 9, when King Jehu takes over the throne. That's what the people do. They lay their coats before him. When he walks over them, that is a symbol of submission of the people, making someone their king. That's what it means. And actually, the Maccabean revolt, which isn't recorded in our Bible, but it is in the Catholic book, the Apocrypha, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. There was a history about 200 years before Jesus where the Maccabeans revolted against Antiochus Epiphanes, and he had slaughtered a pig on the altar to God in the temple, and that's a no-go if you're Jewish, right? He had tried to stamp out Judaism entirely, crucified thousands of them, and this one family, the Maccabeans, rose up in revolt and actually overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a long descendant from Alexander the Great's general. And the Jews finally, for a few years, had their own rule under the Maccabeans. But the Maccabeans weren't from the Davidic line. But they had a history of, for a while, they were the ones who kind of ran and oversaw Jerusalem until, eventually the Romans came, and then all that kind of ended. But in the Maccabean revolt, they laid palm branches before the Maccabean leaders, and that was a sign of you're in charge, you're the king, you're the leader. Simon Maccabeus, it was a symbol of his victory and a symbol of we're purifying this nation after Antiochus Epiphanes has desecrated us. He's desecrated the temple and annihilated the Jewish people. We're taking it back and purifying it. So when these people are laying coats in front of Jesus and palm branches in front of Jesus, they know what they're doing. Everybody knows what it means. It means we're making you our king. We're telling you, come on, be in charge. You're the one we're going to establish as the king. Take over this nation, take over these people, take over, king, and be in charge. Their understanding is it's time for a revolution. That's what they're seeing. That's what they're doing. Right? So they're coming on this scene, and I get a kick out of Matthew because there are people like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? They know what's going on. Right? They're seeing the coats laid down. They're seeing the palm branches laid down. People who traveled from all over the Roman Empire saying, who is this guy that's riding the donkey? And there are people saying, well, this is the prophet from Galilee, and everybody's heard of him by now. So everybody by now, in 3.5 years into Jesus' life, has heard the stories, the miracles, the raising of the dead, the healings that have happened. They all know the stories. So everybody's like, yes, this is the guy. Let's make him our king. Let's put him on the throne. Romans, you watch out because it's about to go down. Right? And that's what they're all thinking. And I think the story is really interesting for this whole other reason. It's like they see a king who's coming, but they don't see the God who's coming. They don't see that it is God who's arriving in their midst. This is why less than a week later, they're turning on him and wanting to kill him. Because when Jesus arrived, he didn't do what they wanted him to do. And he didn't do it the way they wanted it done. And he did something else instead. But it's interesting the route he takes, because he's on the Mount of Olives. He's come out of Bethany, up the backside, up through Bethphage, and down the Mount of Olives and into Jerusalem through the east gate, rides up to the temple, and there he's going to do something in the temple. And if you look at it, the Mount of Olives is interesting. It's about 2,700 feet above Jerusalem and 400,000 feet above sea level. I think I have a drawing of what Jerusalem would have looked like in the old Jesus' time. Is that the next slide? Yes. That would have been the temple in Jesus' time. It would have looked like that. Of course, the Romans have destroyed this, so it doesn't exist anymore. You see that grand staircase that's coming down right there, and the bends to the, as we look at it bends to our right. That actual staircase is currently underground. It was found by archaeologists, though, and underground it's been reassembled, that archway, that grand staircase, because all the rubble from the city got thrown into that valley when the Romans destroyed it and filled it up. And in 1,000 years since, 2,000 years since, it's been filled with more debris and more rubble and more dirt. So that staircase is actually underground now. But it was discovered by archaeologists about 100 years ago. And you see the long causeway bridge that's up in that other side there? That actually, too, is also underground, but they have found that. Archaeologists have found that. That's why artists are able to piece this back together again. You see how high the temple is, right? And on the other side, if the artist would have drawn the view from the other side, what we're looking at is we're seeing the Mount of Olives there. We're seeing the temple, Jerusalem, the downtown city, the Temple Mount. You see the white building is the temple, and that hill in the background would have been the Mount of Olives, right? That would have been what it looked like in Jesus' day. And on the other side, if you'd have stood on the top wall that goes around the Temple Mount, it was a 1,000-foot drop to the valley below, right? So it's this huge thing. So Jesus is riding up there, and he rides from there through the city gates. I think this is what it looks like today. Yeah, so today there's the Temple Mount, and you can still see the wall, which they've been able to do some rebuilding on. I'm not 100% sure it's the exact wall. The staircase that we saw that bends down and to the right that we saw in our picture is the modern-day Wailing Wall. That's the modern-day Western Wailing Wall. That's where that is. So this is what it looks like today. And here we're looking at it. I think this is a view from the southern edge looking at what it looks like in this modern times. And so that's it now. The temple is long gone, of course, in the Dome of the Rock. That mosque is sitting there instead of a temple because the temple got destroyed in 70 A.D., never got rebuilt after that. And so we're looking at that kind of thing. So at the time that the temple was being destroyed, way back 586, so we're talking, 600 years before Jesus, at the time the temple was being destroyed, a whole bunch of Jews had been grabbed out of Jerusalem and hauled off to Babylon. And there they were, and this is about 70 years before Zechariah's prophecy. There were prophets who lived in that time. Jeremiah would be one, Ezekiel another. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem, and he prophesied from Jerusalem, and we have his book. Ezekiel went with the captives. He was dragged off to Babylon, and he saw things from God, and he was in Babylon with the captives that were there. And all of the captives in Babylon kept talking like, we're going to go back, we're going to go back, we're going to go back. And this isn't going to last because God's going to protect, Jerusalem. What they don't know is the Jews had become so wicked, so evil that God had let go of them and said, you don't have my protection anymore. That's why they were stuck in Babylon. And as they're talking about when we're going to go back, you got Ezekiel way off in Babylon with this captive group of Jews telling him, you better settle down and you better make homes and you better be in here because God's saying you're going to be here for 70 years. Right? If God told you you're going to be stuck in the town you're in the house you're in, the place you live for 70 years, right? What would you do? Some of you would be like, I'll be dead before this thing is over, right? And the Jews do that too. So Ezekiel's telling them that. Settle down because it won't be you, but it might be your grandkids and great-grandkids who go back, but it won't be you. Settle down, build houses, marriage, intermarriage, and that's when he gives that famous verse of, that I know my plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope in the future. You know who he's telling that to? A bunch of people in Babylon who are not going to be allowed to go back to Jerusalem. That's who gets that verse. And so here's Ezekiel, and Ezekiel's way off there in Babylon with this group of people who think that this is only going to be a temporary thing. And they're not exactly sure why Jerusalem got destroyed by the Babylonians. They're like, what happened? God abandoned us. And Ezekiel has to be the one to tell them, no, you abandoned God. And once you abandoned God, you lost his protection. And once you lost his protection, this thing was over. And that's what happened. You abandoned God. God didn't abandon you. And at one point, in Ezekiel, he's sitting there, he's this prisoner of war, and he's sitting there, and he has this vision. God opens up and says, let me show you the spiritual realities. He's way the heck and gone up in Babylon, but here's the first part of his vision that happens in Ezekiel chapter 10. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple. So he's in Babylon getting a vision of the temple of God back in Jerusalem. And he sees it I don't know if he's seeing it in his mind or seeing it through his eyes. We don't know, but it's definitely considered a vision. And the cherubim were the holy angels that are under the throne of God. And he says, now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man went in. So there was this, earlier you read back, there's this other angel, and he refers to him as this man. And the cloud filled the inner court. And then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and paused over the threshold of the temple. And the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. And the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard even in the outer court, like the voice of Almighty God when he speaks. If you know anything about, the temple, there was this Ark of the Covenant deep inside the very center of the temple called the Holy of Holies. And the Ark of the Covenant sat in this little room. No one was ever allowed to go in there, except the high priest, and only once a year. On the Day of Atonement, he could go in there, and he was supposed to sprinkle some blood on this little altar, this golden box with 2 cherubim angels on it, which was God's throne, and he would sprinkle blood on that once a year on the Day of Atonement on behalf of all the people. And they actually tied a rope to his ankle and put bells on his robe so they could hear him moving around behind the curtain back there, because if he was evil or something went down and he was struck dead by God, which had happened with the ark before, no one was going to go in there and get him out. Right? So they had a rope tied around his ankle, so if he was struck dead, they could drag him out with a rope. And this is the place where the glory of God was, and no one could come near the glory of God. So now Ezekiel's seeing that glory of God lift up out of the temple, and he's no longer inside the temple, but he's sitting on top and moving to the front door of the temple, the threshold of the temple. He's moving to the gate of the temple. And then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. And they went out, and the wheels were beside them, and they stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house. So now they're moving east from the temple. They're moving east. And the glory of the Lord of Israel was above them. So what he's watching is, we think God's got our back, and he's watching God actually abandon the temple. At this time, it hadn't been destroyed yet. They were captives in Babylon. The Babylonians had surrounded Jerusalem, but hadn't destroyed it yet. And he's watching God lift up out of the temple and start moving east. And then, and the passage is interesting, there's this whole section goes on about, I'm going to give you take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will regather Israel from the 4 corners of the earth. That's how the passage goes on. And you get to passage 11, Ezekiel 11, it says this. So the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain. Remember, he's traveling east. So what's the mountain east? Mount of Olives, right. So he's up to the mountain and stood on the mountain, which is on the east side of the city. And then the Spirit took me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea, that's Babylon, to those in captivity. And the vision that I had seen went up from me, so I spoke to those in captivity of all the things that he had shown me. And so what's interesting is Ezekiel's watching. The Babylonian army has surrounded Jerusalem. He's clear off in Babylon, this land of the Chaldees, and he's watching in a vision the glory of the Lord leave the temple, move to the threshold of the Temple Mount on the east side, out to the city gate, up on the Mount of Olives, and then our assumption is, and then high above them, meaning the Spirit of God was leaving, was absolutely abandoning this nation, abandoning Jerusalem, which would happen because the Babylonians would march in there and wipe everything out and obliterate the temple, absolutely destroy it, right? Level it. Not one stone would be left upon another. And that's what he sees. So what's interesting is when they go back 70 years later to rebuild the temple, they do rebuild it, but it's smaller scale, not as grand, not as beautiful. The first temple, when they dedicated it, the glory of the God came down and hit that temple, and smoke and fire and everything filled that temple so much that all the priests even had to get out. No one could be in the presence of God. When they dedicated the second temple after 70 years, that didn't happen. The glory of God didn't fill even that second temple. And then it goes on. It's interesting because Ezekiel will write a bunch of other stuff and prophesy a bunch of other stuff. He gets all the way to chapter 43, and check out what he says in chapter 43. Afterward, he brought me to the gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city. The visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came to the temple by way of the gate which faces toward the east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So here he is in chapter 43. What he's basically saying is, God gave me a second vision. And the second vision is, I watched the glory of God enter the city the same way he had left. I watched him leave up out of the temple, over the threshold, out the east gate, up to the Mount of Olives, and gone. In chapter 43, he says, I saw the glory of the God return to the Mount of Olives, through the east gate, back into the temple, and filling it again. When did that happen? Probably when Jesus rode the donkey from the Mount of Olives through the east gate and up to the temple. And no one could actually see that it was the glory of God filling Jerusalem again, just like Ezekiel promised. Like Ezekiel would happen. And they couldn't see it because, well, he looked like a dirty carpenter sitting on a donkey. He didn't look like the glory of the Lord. But that was what was happening. The Creator God, the glory of the Lord was filling it. And then what's interesting, Jesus knew they would reject him. This story being told in Luke, what's interesting is in Luke, he'll tell the same story about him riding the donkey. And the Gospel of Luke, he stops in the middle of the processional and he starts crying. And it says this in verse 41 of Luke 19. I'm not sure I have this one up there. I have the Luke. Yeah. Now, as he drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it. He's riding the donkey at this time. He saw and he wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this day, this your day, the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. As Jesus is riding the donkey, and they're laying the clothes before him and throwing the palm branches down and saying, Hosanna, and glory to God in the highest, and blessed be who comes in the name of the Lord. Somewhere in the middle of that processional, he starts crying because he knows, even though you're proclaiming me as king, y'all don't get it. You're going to reject me. Before this week is out, you're going to reject me. And because you're rejecting me, you're not going to get the promises God offered. You're not going to get all the things that God said Messiah would do. You're not going to get the king you want because you're going to reject this king before the week is out. And he sees that while he's sitting on the donkey. And it's interesting, I look at this whole thing, and Ezekiel prophesies in chapter 44 about the fact that the east gate was very interesting. And when the Romans would come from Jesus' time, about 30 years later, about 30 years later, they destroy it in 70 A.D. They start the fight around then. So 70 A.D., Jesus is about 33 A.D. The Romans would come, and they indeed would surround Jerusalem and utterly destroy the temple. That temple would be gone, and leaving no stone upon another. They would obliterate it. They would once again throw all the rubble down into the valley, and that whole Jerusalem would be abandoned. In fact, when they captured Jerusalem, they killed and slaughtered so many people. It was just devastating to the population for generations. And then the other thing that would happen is they would take the people that did survive, they would sell them into slavery throughout the Roman Empire. They sold so many slaves, it collapsed the slave market. Slaves became worthless because there were so many for sale on the market. And then there was... Believe it or not, there was another Jewish revolt in 136, right? So it only took about another 60 years, and they're revolting again. And this time the Romans went in and said, that's it, all Jews are gone. They kicked all the Jews out of that area and renamed it from Judea. They renamed it Palestine. The Romans did that. That's how it was called Palestine. There was never a Palestine country. There was never, even at that time, Palestine, they were just grabbing the name Philistine, and they were in Latin term, they were saying, let's just obliterate this Jewish people and give this land to the Philistines, who had kind of had a history here too. So that's who they gave it to, renamed it Palestine, and it stayed that name to this day. 2,000 years later, we're still living by that. But the prophecy was, the king would come from the Mount of Olives, the eastern gate, up to Jerusalem, and set things straight. It's interesting because in the 6th and 7th century, so about 700 years after the Romans destroyed it, the Byzantine Empire went in there, and they kind of rebuilt the city. So you're talking the 600s, the 600 era, late 500s, early 600s. They rebuild it, and they rebuild the wall. And they actually find the old eastern gate, and they set it up on top of the location of where it had always historically been. And then, of course, as we know, there were the Crusades, and boom, the British came in, the French came in, and then they got kicked out by the Saracens and Saladin and all this wars back and forth for the longest time, till finally the Ottoman Turks took over, and Suleiman the Magnificent took over the city in 1541. And in 1541, there were Jews still living in the area. They had come back from the Roman times. They'd always been there. They'd never actually, completely obliterated Judaism as much as the Romans had tried. Over the centuries, they'd come back. And now, when he was there was this Jewish legend that had come from their scriptures that one day a king would come and he would ride through that eastern gate. And he would take over and set himself up, and the Jews would become the people of God again. So Suleiman the Magnificent decided, instead of listening to the rabbis, what he did is he walled up the city gate on the eastern side. I think I got a picture of it. So that you can see the eastern gate, Dome of the Rock there, and you see that wall. And there's a close-up of the eastern gate today. It's all walled in. It was discovered in 1969. Archaeologists dug it open, thinking, let's go through the gate that Jesus rode the donkey through. Let's see what it looks like. And in 1969, the archaeologists dug it, and they realized it was completely walled up by Suleiman the Magnificent. And then on top of that, he put a cemetery in front of it because he believed no holy man would ever walk through a cemetery and do that. So they put a graveyard in front of it to make sure no Jewish Messiah was ever going to come through this gate again. Right? And that's what it looks like to this day. Now, as a Christian, you're going to think one of two things. Too late, king already came through the gate. That prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus rode the donkey. Or you're thinking, that's going to happen someday in the future when Jesus returns the second time, and that gate's going to be open somehow. One of those two thoughts are probably going through your mind as a Christian, and I could go either way. Either like, no big deal because the prophecy was already fulfilled when Jesus rode the donkey, or he's going to return the exact same way again and do it again. We'll see what happens. I don't know, right? And it's interesting because there's this passage in Zechariah, the same one who wrote the prophecy about the donkey. This is an interesting passage. Zechariah 14. Then the Lord, he's talking, at the time Zechariah is writing, he's writing about some future event that will take place way off in the future, when once again Jerusalem will be surrounded by her enemies. She will about to be destroyed. It's going to go down. She'll be completely surrounded, and Jerusalem's fading. And he says, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half towards the south. And then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach to Azael. Yes, you shall flee as you fled in the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with him. Or some say with you, so I'm not sure what the translation should be. Now, okay, when did that happen? When did the Mount of Olives get split in two when Jesus stood on it? Never. It hasn't happened yet. Is that an end times prophecy? I think so. When he says, okay, all these prophecies have happened, but there's still one yet to happen. Jerusalem will be surrounded once again by her enemies, about to go down, and God's going to show up on the scene again, and God's going to return again, and Jesus is going to stand on the Mount of Olives. Only this time a massive earthquake will split the Mount of Olives in two directions so that people can flee through it. Now, if you would have asked me, I've read Revelation and read all these books about end times and stuff for many years. And if you would have asked me, I would have said, well, it's not going to happen probably in my lifetime because there's no major mention in any of Revelation or these prophecies that are from the Old Testament about a Western power. There's no influence of a Western power on Jerusalem in its final days, which I've always thought to mean there can't be a United States of America the last days because the United States of America is always playing the most significant role in all the world stage today. So in order for there to be all those end times events, there can't be a United States of America. Until this year. And this year I finally realized, there's another way that equation could work out. America could not care anymore and turn its back on Israel and say, you're on your own, pal. And until this year, that wouldn't have dawned on me as a probability. And now I think, that's highly probable. So are we living in the last days? Well, we're one day closer than we were yesterday, that's for sure. Right? So I look at this and I think, wow, I mean, God's doing something interesting. And when does Jesus return? Matthew 23 will tell us when he returns. Jesus said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This is Jesus saying, and we know he's the King of Kings, you're not going to see me again until one more time you're looking for the Messiah. When you start crying for the Messiah again, that's the when I will come again and I'll show myself to you. Jesus, those are his own words. So I look at this story of Jesus riding the donkey, it's like, oh man, there is so much going on. There is so much going on about God and his glory and moving and prophecies being fulfilled in the eastern gate, an eastern gate now plugged up and all that has gone on. And was it fulfilled? Yes, it certainly was. Will it be fulfilled again in the future? Maybe. Maybe. It's yet to still be fulfilled when he comes at the second coming. Jesus shows up, goes into the temple riding his donkey, and this is just crazy. This story is like one of the more famous ones in the Bible, right? Verse 12 of Matthew 21. And then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." And then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of babes and nursing infants you shall have perfected praise?" And then he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. So Jesus rides the donkey, goes right up to Jerusalem, goes into the temple. Now the Gospel of Mark has a slight change. Gospel of Mark tells the same story and says he got to the temple, looked around, and it was late at night, left, went back out of town, spent the night, and came back the next day and cleared the temple out. Could have been. And Matthew conflated these into one. But it's interesting because he walks around the temple court, and I think I've got, let's look at that. Yeah, so the temple court, right? We saw the artist rendition. There's another one. So you see the two walkways, the causeway, Robinson's Arch, Wilson's Arch, that are now named after the archaeologists who found them, and the gates that have been dug up. So this is the actual court. So you had, the Jews could go into the inner court, and then only the priests could go into the other side of the wall there. But that great big outer courtyard was supposed to be the court of the Gentiles. If you were a God-fearer who wanted to know the one true God, you would come to that courtyard. And the idea was, in that courtyard, that's as close as you could get to God as a Gentile who had not completely converted to Judaism. But there is where you could offer your praises, your alms, your sacrifices. There's where you would be taught. They would have rabbis in that courtyard who would teach you lessons about all these Old Testament prophets and about the Hebrew Scriptures. That was actually meant to be, the whole walls and the colonnades all around was meant to be a teaching area. Solomon's porch was built back in the time of Solomon. Was supposed to be this area where you would come and you would learn about God. By the time you get to Jesus, that courtyard instead was full of vendors of all kinds selling their wares and mostly selling stuff to do with the temple. So if you were coming to the temple and you as a poor person needed to offer a sacrifice, the law said you had to give two doves. Two little doves would be because you couldn't afford a lamb because you were poor. And so you would go to the marketplace, and there you knew, like, I have to offer a sin sacrifice. I couldn't really carry doves in my pocket all the way from Galilee. So I'll get down there, and I'm going to buy a couple doves, and I'm going to take them in. Now, outside the temple court, a couple doves went for about $4. Inside the temple court, they went for $75. Right? So it's like Disneyland. Disneyland prices in the temple court, right? That's what you had. And so they would go in there, and it was just absolutely full. There were money changers, so people coming from all over the world, right? So they had coins from Greece, and coins from Spain, and coins from North Africa, coins from the Parthians. They had coins from all over the world. So they would come, but you couldn't bring any currency into the temple. It was holy and sacred, so only a certain kind of coin was allowed in the temple area. So you would have to go to the money changers table and take all your money and lay it on the table and do the exchange rate. What kind of rate do you think you got, right? well, the current currency is like, oh, it's 1.2. And they would give you like, yeah, not here it isn't, right? It's going to take 10 of those coins to buy one of ours. So it ended up being this huge extortion game. Not only was it this massive extortion game, but no more was anybody teaching or any of that. There was no more preaching and teaching in the courtyards because it was all taken up with these booths that were selling and extorting people out of their money and buying lambs for 10 times the price and doves and money changers tables and food stuff and all this kind of stuff was going on. This is what Jesus walks into. He's like, this is supposed to be the place where people meet God, where people who want to love God get a chance. This is supposed to be the place where Gentiles can come in and learn about the one true God. And you Jewish leaders are responsible to teach the world about me. And instead, you're ripping everybody off in my name. No wonder he was mad. No wonder he was upset. The thing that was supposed to bring people closer to God had been turned into a corrupt thing. They actually, in Jesus' time, referred to them as the marketplace of Annas. Annas was the high priest. And it was his family mob who ran the courts. So the priesthood was getting fat and rich, but only the priesthood of his family. The normal priests were super poor. They got rabbi writings that have survived from the times. Rabbis trying to redo the laws so that the guys who were not part of his family could get something. They shouldn't have to live in abject poverty while this one family in the priestly line was getting filthy rich. This is what Jesus is upset about. Right? So he's going and he's clearing the temple because he's saying it's supposed to be a house of prayer. And what's interesting is for the next week, as you read through the Gospel of Matthew and read through the other Gospels, Jesus takes over the temple courts. And that buying and selling and trading ain't happening because it all gets kicked outside the temple because he will go to the temple and teach and preach for the next week. And mobs of people will come to hear him. By the thousands, so many people come to hear Jesus that the Jewish leaders are afraid to act because there's so many people in the temple court who are on his side. Jesus finally sets the temple right. And I'm reading this, and I think he's clearing it. It's so interesting. Now, honestly, the buying and the selling wasn't wrong because you had to buy a couple doves, you had to buy a lamb, you had to be able to do that. It was the extortion of it that was wrong. Even in the Old Testament, there was, families had to buy a lamb. If you were poor, 2 families should join and buy 1 lamb. So that was actually okay. It was the extortion of it, and it was the fact that it went inside the temple court and ruined the worship of the Gentiles. That's what he's mad about, right? It was the corrupt practices, the exorbitant prices, the bad exchange rates, the top priests taking it all. The whole thing was this absolutely awful, corrupt system, right? Interpreter's Bible Commentary says this about Jesus and this temple thing. Jesus' protest was not against the system of sacrifices or against the half-shekel tax. The temple was dear to him, and he rejoiced in its ordinances when they were kept in sincerity. His protest was against extortion and graft, not only because they were an injustice to men, but because they were an offense to God in God's own house. But God's intent, it was a house of prayer for all nations. By man's making, it was a grafting marketplace. Man has a terrible freedom and within his own measure of creatorship. But if man's making be wrenched away from God's intent, it becomes first a disfigurement and then a tragedy. An enemy destroyed the temple? Yes. But the Jews themselves had already destroyed it. And in the strange outworkings of history, the enemy was a scourge in the hand of God. A true temple is the radiating center of a mission. For the Jews before Jesus' time, that mission was the tidings of the one God. For a Christian church today, it's the proclamation of the gospel. The temple in the time of Christ was trying to live on and for itself, and so it died. A true temple is the home of the brotherhood. Jesus was concerned for the rights and love of the Gentiles. Their court in the temple had been outraged. Doubtless the inscription placed between the court, that outer court and the inner court grieved him. And the inscription said, "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade. Whoever is caught will be answerable for his own death, which will ensure." No man was a stranger to Jesus. And there, the balustrades of racial and class and prejudice within are there these balustrades of racial and class prejudice within our churches? No fences exist within the mercy of God, or even within our common need and hope. A true temple is a home of worship and prayer. Marketing is right if it obeys God. when it usurps the place of God, it is a raucous greed that invites the judgment. I was thinking about this. You can't help but read something like Jesus saying, my house shall be a house of prayer. And I'm reading this, my first thing is I think about, my situation and me, and I'm like, dang, Lord, we got a coffee shop in your house. What about us, right? Are we cool here, Lord? And he and I sat and talked with this a little bit, and I had this thought. I goes, well, I remember sitting in a 12,000 square foot building downtown that sat empty all week long waiting around for Sunday. And not much prayer happened, not much Bible study happened, almost none. I'd say no prayer happened, waiting for outside of Sunday, in my office maybe. But as a community, no. Bible study happened? No, they'd given up doing that. So we sold that building and we moved here. And yeah, we got a coffee shop, right? We don't actually make a lot of money on our coffee shop. In fact, the rent that Patati Coffee pays us to be in our building only covers slightly under 1/10 of our monthly budget. So 90% of our income comes from you guys. Your tithes, your offerings, that's what keeps us going. So Thursday, when Mary Lisa Brown sat on the stage with two of the top economic, housing, and human service leaders and discussed with a room full of people about what's going to happen with homelessness over the next 2 years and the trajectory of money being spent and programs are going to be offered and how we're going to try to fix that crisis in Spokane, that conversation took place right here. And it only took place right here because you guys pay the bills, right? You guys are doing that. We're not making money off this other stuff. That's not where it happens. And then I got to thinking about the coffee shop and how many times I'll walk out of my office and I'll come out and there's any given day of the week I can introduce you to 3 pastors in Spokane because they're sitting in our coffee shop. And I watch them counseling people with a Bible on the table open. And they're praying with people. And every Wednesday I have a hard time studying because a group of PTSD vets are in the room right beside me yelling at each other as they're trying to study the Bible together and deal with their PTSD, right? But they're studying the Bible together. And there's one day a week where about 5 or 6 of these old guys, one who was a Bible translator for Wycliffe Bible translators, one who was a therapist, they're all over 70, and they sit in that corner back there on the couches and they do a Bible study. And I got to thinking about all the other Bible studies that happen here in this church. And I got to think about all the times I'll walk out and there's tables of ladies with the Bibles in front of them and they're praying for each other and they're doing that. And there's women's ministry that meets back here on Mondays and the men's ministries who meets in the victory over the darkness studies that happen. And I think, you know what? We might have a coffee shop, but we got more prayer going on here than any church I know. We have more Bible study going on all the time than any church I know, right? And I kind of felt like, when would God say it's wrong? It would be wrong when the coffee shop drove the church or when the church compromised to make the coffee shop economic. Right now, it's like it's all kind of okay. They're running things, but actually they're providing a space for us to do ministry in. So I kind of sat with Jesus for a while on that, and he said, is it still a house of prayer? I'm like, absolutely. Is it a place where people learn about God? Absolutely. More than one day a week? Absolutely, right? And you know what's weird? About half the people praying in here and reading the Bible in here are not under my church authority or control. They're people from elsewhere in the neighborhood. All kinds of other pastors coming here and using this place. We've got a couple sister churches who come in here and have staff meetings around in our sanctuary, in our church. They're holding staff meetings, doing strategic planning for the kingdom of God because we have a coffee shop. So I kind of felt like God was saying, you're good. You're good. If you ever lose the prayer or lose the Bible study, and I've talked to some people who come into the coffee shop and they've told me, we come here and study here because we know if we lay Bibles on the table and pray, it's going to be cool. We're not sure what Starbucks would do with us or whether we'd be allowed to do that there. So we do it here. And I kind of felt like God was saying, you're good. You're good, right? And I was thinking about all the different things that are going on and the prayer that's happening. And I got to thinking about Jesus cleansing the temple. And easy to say, it's the Dome of the Rock sitting there now. There is no temple. If Jesus were to come back in the modern times and go to the temple to cleanse it, where would he go? Where would he go, right? And I'm sitting on that for a day or so as I'm reading this passage and thinking about this sermon. And then a couple verses just punched me in the nose. Look at these 2 verses. Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? I was sitting with these two verses. If Jesus were to come back and ride a donkey to the temple today, march right up there to see what's going on in my holy temple, where would he go? He would come to you and me, my friend. He would come into our lives, into our hearts. He would come into our houses. And he would look around and say, what you got going on here in your house? What do you guys got happening here? And I wonder in my own life, if he'd be turning some tables over, saying, this is a distraction, psh, this has no business being here. What is this? Get rid of this. This is interfering with my relationship with you. Would he clear the court if he were to come to your house? Right? And I was thinking about that Bible verse that said, you know, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That means Jesus would probably come in and say, okay, log on to your bank account, let's take a look. What would he say? Would he be cleaning house if he were to come to us as the temple of God? I always love it when I can project these Bible verses on other people and say they're the problem. I like those Bible verses better. But every now and then you got to stop and say, wait a minute, this one's for me. What would he say to me if he rode the donkey of his glory into my home and came and sat in my living room and said to me, what you got going on in here? And I think there might be some tables getting turned over for all of us. And I think Jesus' desire is like, yeah, instead of making it a raucous thing, why don't we talk about that right now? Because he wants it to be a house of prayer. You're the temple. He wants you and I to always be in relationship with him, thinking about him, praying to him, making him involved in our daily lives. He wants our treasure to be where our heart is, and he wants our heart in heaven. He wants our heart with the gospel. He wants us doing these things that would unite us with him in our hearts and in our behaviors and in everything that happens. And I think he would say to us, I don't want to come and create mayhem. He's not a God who brings mayhem. He'll bring justice, but he wants to bring peace and joy and righteousness and hope to all of us. And so he's actually inviting us to a higher level. He's inviting us to something grander. He's inviting us to participate in a deeper way with him and his gospel and his kingdom. He's constantly inviting us, and we are distracted. And so as we close today, I'm just going to pray a prayer that God would say, Lord, show us our distractions. Why don't you stand with me? Hey, Jesus, it's us. Here we are, and you know us intimately. You know our story collectively, and you know our stories privately. It's easy for us to look back at you riding the donkey and being shocked and astonished and dismayed and disgusted that people would proclaim you king and then cry for Barabbas 5 days later. And Lord, we don't want to be that kind of person. And we know that if you were to ride humbly into our lives and took a good look at us and how we behave and what our priorities are, how we're spending our money and how we're spending our time, what our focus is, we all are standing here saying we got areas that would not please you. And so we're going to invite you, Lord, to come into our lives, since we are your temple anyway, and clean some house. And we'd like to do it with you, not fighting you and not against you, but with you. Would you come and open up our minds and our thoughts to see what we need to do, what we need to let go of, what we need to not cherish so much, and bring instead things that are really worthwhile for the eternity's sake and for your kingdom's glory. Lord, would you cleanse our temple? We know it's going to hurt to even say that and pray that, but would you do that? Because we know that if that can happen, our peace with you and our peace and joy with the world around us would get so much better. And so with trust and with love and believing in your goodness and your mercy, we take ourselves and we say, here I am, Jesus. Come and clean house. Come and clean house, and I'll work with you on it. This is our prayer. We pray this day in your holy and righteous name as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Amen. All right. God bless you guys. We're going to pick more of this story up next week. I'm excited to see what God says.